Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Environmental Coffee House. I am Sandy Shellis, and uh, Tony, Antonio Reid, and Jim Massa are with me, and I am actually in the background. And Nicholas, unfortunately, guys, had a kind of a family emergency, and we just found this out, and I feel really, really bad. So if all of you I will put the links to Nick's Patreon so you can read his writing. He's starting to write again. I feel really bad. I mean, he's so busy with his PhD as it is. So that's my little thing. And welcome, guys. Welcome, Tony. Tony, you lead. And Jim, it's so great to see you here. It's just great to have you guys. But I'm out. So, Tony, take it away.
Yeah, thanks so much, Sandy, for first updating us with the Nick situation. And of course,
Yeah.
our thoughts go out to you, Nicholas, in your situation. And thank you, Jim, for being here for this next episode of The State of the Planet. And of course, thank you, our audience, for tuning in. Unfortunately, tonight's State of the Planet is going to be a very sobering discussion about some of the extreme events that we've been seeing happening around the world. In fact, we've been seeing countries around the world facing oppressive heat. Obviously, from the United States, we've been seeing an extreme heat wave here, where the middle of the country is reaching triple digits, all the way from California, Texas, Kansas, Ohio, of course, here in North Carolina, and even parts of the northeastern United States. More impressively, we've seen heat waves in Japan. Over in Japan, we saw temperatures near Tokyo reach almost 40 degrees Celsius. For those looking at thermostats in Fahrenheit, that's nearly 104 degrees, historic for Tokyo. We were seeing a similar heat wave hit the UK and Europe altogether. The UK almost hit temperatures of 40 degrees, the first time that such temperatures have been recorded since records were being taken place on the island of the United Kingdom. We also saw historic wildfires outbreaking in the United Kingdom, along in Spain, France, Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Germany. We're also seeing historic wildfires break out in places like China, that was also facing oppressive heat waves. The Japanese heat wave was so intense that the Japanese government had moved to turn back on their nuclear reactors. There's a lot of controversy about nuclear power in Japan after the failure of the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plants after the 2011 earthquake. And many of the Japanese had moved to shut down their nuclear plants in response and turn on gas, coal, and import more fossil fuel energy into the country. And of course, these heat waves have been so brutal for mainland Japan that the tax on the energy grid through the use of air conditioning has skyrocketed across the northern hemisphere, and particularly in developing countries where they have access to air conditioning. And this additional energy tax on the energy grid forced the Japanese down to go back to their nuclear power plants, which in some sense is good because they'll be moving away. But at the same time, we're looking at, um, while we're facing oppressive heat waves across the world, we're also facing extremely high inflation and energy cost as well. So we're kind of having a dual hit here. Um, and the last thing I want to say before we move on to Jim's part here is that the United States has, over the last year, been debating what it should do in climate costs. Of course, we just are watching the devastating floods hit Kentucky, where they received over a foot of rain in some areas in a very short period of time. I think the number of dead are up to over 26 now in the state of Kentucky, being devastated by out of control flash flooding. The United States has put together a climate package led by the Democrat Joe Manchin for $300 billion. Now, understand that this is coming a year after the failure Build Back Better, which had proposed $1.2 trillion in social spending and climate spending. And I think the round the House in that bill was between 200 and $300 billion specifically for climate. This bill is 300 to 400 billion dollars only. Okay, but a significant portion of that 300 to 400 billion dollars is geared to climate. But you have to understand, this is an order of magnitude less money to where we ought to be spending if we wanted to avert the sort of worst climate catastrophes if such a cost was even possible. And the current plan keeps us well below our current Paris pledges by 2030 as well, in terms of reducing carbon dioxide emissions in the United States. So it will be interesting to see if American policymakers get more aggressive as we deal with increasing climate extremes. Nick, did you want to have anything to say or comment?
Well,
Jim.
first of all,
Sorry, Jim.
first of all, it's really good to be back on here. It's good to see you again there, Tony and Sandy. Well, Alaska this year has set a record for the most acreage burned in a single fire season. It's been over 3 million acres. You have the continuing fires in Siberia, which really never really ended since a couple of years ago. Northern Scandinavia had also seen some fires. Don't forget this extreme fires that we saw in Australia a couple of years back. That was very devastating, killing millions and millions of animals and other organisms. It's One could almost say that the Anthropocene is now becoming more of a Pyrocene at this point because of all these fires that are just taking place all over the place. There was also a flash flood that took place in the UAE just the other day. That the torrents of water in the UAE, of all places, just sweeping through town, just taking out windows and vehicles and creating all sorts of havoc. It, we're seeing all sorts of crazy extremes. We're seeing the drought, we're seeing the fires, the hot temperatures, the so-called precipitation bombs. We're seeing a lot of devastation, and it's all due to all this excess energy that's in the system. And it's not going to get any better. It's only going to get worse from here on out. Uh, just as the IPCC saying, "Oh, we're at 1.2," it's really more like 1.6. They've already warmed up, and when you look at the research that the PIK group out of Potsdam, Germany, did, uh, they developed. It's a start, but they developed models that looked at the interactions among tipping elements. So they looked at ENSO, they looked at the sea ice, they looked at the Amazon, etc., etc. All these different aspects, AMOC, and what they concluded was that an increase of 1.3 C is enough to create chaos in the weather patterns. Well, if you take the IPCC 1.2, 1.3 is not far away, and this would be logical. But if you look at what a lot of other researchers are indicating that at a minimum we've warmed up 1.6, well, and this PIK group is saying 1.3, we've already blown past that. And one could say that the PIK group pretty much spot on with their assessment.
Well, we certainly have been seeing dynamic changes in the global average temperature. Oscillations certainly have gotten more extreme to the warm side. And part of the consequence of this extreme warmth is extreme drought. And the extreme drought is in the vegetation and foliage is fueling these wildfires. And so, like you say, we're moving into almost a pyrocene phase because the vegetation isn't able to move with the climate, obviously. And so, as the climate dynamically changes, the vegetation is left behind to deal with the new changes, and of course, isn't able to keep up. But this is hitting us dynamically. For example, look at the level of water that is just disappearing across the western United States right now. Lake Mead, of course, is at its record low level since the dam has been built, since the Hoover Dam has been built. So we're seeing that happen, but of course, more dramatically, we're seeing this happen across equatorial Latin America. We're seeing this happening across equatorial Africa and equatorial Asia as well. And this is really beginning to start to destabilize populations in those areas because they're just simply not able to deal with you say the wildfires, the heat, which is incredibly intense, um, particularly in parts of the equatorial regions where people typically have less access to air conditioning. Now, this is all being watched by national security in the United States, and they're seeing that our Latin American partners are going to be rapidly destabilizing as we cross, for the IPC 1.5. We've held this 1.5 as the aspirational goal, but look at the world at 1.2. The world at 1.2 is in total chaos. Imagine if we stabilized at zero point 0.3 degrees warmer than where we are today. That world would surely be filled with, as you were describing before, look at what we saw in Australia at the opening of 2020 when wildfires across the continent of Australia had killed 2 billion plus animals. Um, I mean, that's a world at 1.2. A world at 1.5 is going to see a world where we're struggling to feed ourselves on mass scale. Right now, part of the disruption that we're seeing in the global agricultural system has to do with the fact that basically the Ukraine has gone offline and is a major supplier of wheat around the world. But another underlining cause is that we're starting to see that in places like Africa, places like Latin America, places like Equatorial Asia, the intense heat is disabling plants, particularly rice, from germinating. And a lot of agricultural crops really struggle to survive already in those temperature tolerances. And so you're just increasing the temperature by 1 or 2 degrees. You're really taking many of those agricultural plants outside of their ability to adapt. But it's again not just an increasing temperature that's hitting agriculture in these areas, it's also the availability of water. And then, as you say, when we do get the water, it comes in rain bombs. And so, what we're seeing is a transverse effect of immense amounts of water coming down in a deluge after we've had a drought and a wildfire, which loosens the land, which means that the flooding takes away more of the topsoil, making it even more difficult the following year to build on those agricultural practices. So this is something that we're starting to see converge, and we're starting to see it converge increasingly rapidly across the world.
And another thing to keep in mind is that for every 1 degree C increase of the atmosphere can hold about 7% more moisture. So, explains some of the reasons why a lot of the dry areas are getting drier, because what happens, it sucks the moisture out of the ground, but also another reason why you see trees going up so readily in the fires is that uh, with the warmer temperatures, the rates of transpiration increase. So the trees and plants basically are blowing any water content water in there, out through the stomata, and that adds to the moisture in the atmosphere, but also dries out the plants even further, and then they're more vulnerable to just burning outright. Uh, the point about agriculture is an important one because most of the crops that humans grow in quantity are, without getting too technical, called C3 plants. The basic thing with them is that temperatures above 85 Fahrenheit, they don't like. They don't do well in temperatures above that, above 85, and we're consistently getting above that threshold. That is, and it's been measured, been quantified, that crop yields are reducing. And not only are the crop yields reducing, but the nutritional content of whatever crop is able to be harvested is also being reduced. And even staple crops like corn, which is a C4 plant, C4 plants can tolerate warmer, drier conditions. Even corn are being adversely affected now. And that is indeed very troubling in of itself. So we're seeing the impacts on agriculture and everywhere in the world, and then you throw in, you know, political stuff such as what's happening in Ukraine. Um, it it's not the abilities to feed people is being adversely impacted, and that's going to present some challenges. And let's not forget, with all these changing conditions, we're going to be creating areas that will soon be uninhabitable for people, which means climate refugees will result. And these people are going to move to other places on the planet, and that then puts a lot of stress on, not just the land and the government, but just on the whole infrastructure as well. So that that's another looming problem that we'll be looking at.
And you're exactly right. And I think about countries in particular like Mexico. I mean, Mexico is a fairly rich country in the world. And one of the things that middle class Mexicans are able to do, and certainly will be doing, is buying air conditioners. I mean, look at the market for air conditioners right now, are exploding because countries like Canada, countries like Mexico, countries like Japan, countries that ordinarily didn't either have as much access to air conditioning or were out of the zone where air conditioning was necessary for habitability are now buying those things at mass. And I think we're really going to start to see dynamic changes in the local environment where you're going to see these massive deployments of air conditioning. But of course, all that's going to do is increase energy intensity in these countries as well, and likely that's going to result in higher demand for fossil fuels. Which, by the way, the crisis in the Ukraine has now turned the Germans back to opening up their coal-fired power plants. I mean, so this is a real crisis that humanity is in. Our emissions have not reduced since 1990. In fact, we're about 70% higher than we were in 1990. And we're starting to see that I think that we're having a real crisis in terms of the stability of our global system. And climate change is is already, I think, pushing us to the edge as it destabilizes the biosphere. And the most direct impact, as we're talking about, that we're going to have is, of course, against our agriculture system. And the big run up, obviously, is that this is going to cause an immigration crisis across the world. And just for our audience, we have to keep in mind that we are dealing with the surface thread of temperature, but we are also simultaneously dealing with the creeping and growing threat of sea level rise, which is eating up more coastal real estate and coastal agricultural land as well. So we're dealing with this phenomena that is really going to, it looks like in the 2030s and 2040s, kind of collide between our civilizations. And there's real recognition now that among governments and national security and policymakers that we are not able to reduce our emissions in time that will have any impact on the sea level rise, but also any dynamic impact on the stability of countries that are going to be facing these increased droughts, wildfires, and famines.
Well, um, what you're describing is a perfect example of positive feedback loops leading to situations spiraling out of control. More demands for this, you have to burn more fossil fuel, which increases the warming, increases the need for AC, and on it goes. And but even the use of air conditioners, how does an air conditioner work? It takes heat from one location inside the building and dumps it outside. So you fossil fuel, which will increase the heating of the planet, and then you're taking heat from inside the buildings and dumping it outside, further increasing the heating of the air. And when you do that en masse, well, it's going to be a definitely a contributing factor. And as far as with the sea level rise goes, uh, that is a problem. And as we're seeing now, the rate of sea level rise is actually accelerating. And you also then start getting brine infiltration into the water table, which will then adversely affects the crops unless you then be forced to start planting crops that are salt tolerant. And and scientists, botanists are basically working hard and diligently to develop such strains that can tolerate increased salinity levels. But still, I mean, that groundwater won't be drinkable. Once you get that brine infiltration, and we're seeing that in places like Louisiana and Miami and other places around the planet, in low-lying, coastal communities.
Well, and you think about solutions like that, and you think about how feasible that is, because the levels of sea rise that we are locked into, for example, we look at the Thwaites Glacier, which scientists now say is between 1 and 5 years from calving off, in of itself is going to increase uh, global sea levels by 2 feet alone. Um, so when we're talking about saltwater intrusion, it's one thing when we're getting a few millimeters each year. It's quite another when we're getting a few inches or a few feet. So a lot of that land is just simply going to be lost entirely, and I think that's the real crisis that we're getting closer to, is that we're losing our ability to habitate on the land from increased temperature and climate extremes. And then also where we built up huge wards of our civilization on the coast is also being dynamically threatened now. So it will be interesting. But you talk about the air conditioning. I wonder what would be the local effects. What is that going to look like on the climate maps when you start to see Japan almost in its entirety, or England in its entirety? Because very very few people in England have air conditioners, and then just imagine that whole civilization of 54 million people, or plus. I'm not sure what the population of England is. Also, just start buying air conditioners at mass, and like you say, the local impact is there's a heat island effect. So as people are turning on the air conditioners, moving that heat from the inside to the outside, collectively doing this, they're raising the outside temperature, which means that collectively all the air conditioners have to work harder to keep the inside of their houses cool. And so we're going to see that this is going to be very interesting. And one last thing I'll say before handing back off to you is that Glenn Dyer does a really good presentation on the geopolitics of climate change called Climate Wars. You can look it up on YouTube. And one of the ideas that is presented in the early 2000s is this idea that Britain is going to be a lifeboat Britain. But look at how dramatic and extreme the weather oscillations are. It's not that, oh, Britain's going to have a warmer climate that's going to be, is stable. The issue here is climate stability. You're getting a bunch of weather whiplash in every season, whether that has to do with extreme heat or if that's dealing with extreme cold or extreme periods of drought or extreme periods of rain. You're getting those different whiplashes. And that in of itself means that it doesn't really matter where you are. If the climate becomes unpredictable, then habitation also becomes unpredictable.
Yeah, that's and a lot of that is due to the changing jet streams. They've gone more meridional in the flow versus zonal, and so yeah, you can pull down the cooler air from the poles, and you have a cooling effect, and then it'll swing around and pull up the hot air from a lower latitude and bring that up. You can have on one side of the front, a precipitation bomb, and on the other side, it's high heat and drought, uh, and it's just this constant changing. I mean, for example, just this past winter in Alaska, we were going from like 20 above to 20 below, 20 above to 20 below because of the crazy meandering jet stream, bringing up warm air first from like, lower latitude, and then it swings up and over and brings on the cold air from the pole, and we're just getting we were getting these wild swings in the temperatures, and also with that, when it got the warmer temps, we would have precipitation events, and sometimes it wasn't always snow. Let's put it that way. So it's we're
Well,
definitely have really stirred the pot, shall we say.
and that's right now a dynamic impact happening in the Western United States, which I think will be the first major climate refugee zone in the United States domestically because of the water crisis. So, what happens is people are saying, well, Antonio, it is raining in California. It does rain in these places, but that's not the issue. It's not the rain, it's the decreased amount of snowpack. Okay. You get a lot more
Yeah.
snow and it melts over a stable, consistent amount of time throughout the year, whereas rain comes and goes really, really quickly. And depending on soil conditions, it may not actually be captured by natural ecological systems. It may just run off very quickly. So actually, the rain that they're getting doesn't do almost anything to replenish a lot of these reservoirs. And I think that people have to realize that life in places like Phoenix, Arizona, like San Bernardino, like Los Angeles or San Diego or Tucson. Really, I really do believe in the next 10 years, we are going to see a very tragic immigration away in mass from these areas as people realize that the water restrictions are not going to let up, they're not going to end, and in fact, they're going to become indefinite, and actually the water availability is going to disappear. And I think that's a reality that people have to start wrestling with today. Well, of course, people are wrestling with it today, but I think that people have to understand to the extent that they have to wrestle with this. Yes, we are facing a major historic drought in the Western United States. We're facing extreme heat waves. And all of this is decimating the water systems in these areas. I mean, California is the largest, in terms of a state, agricultural center in the United States. Um, and all of that is possible by the availability of water in the West, which now is in complete question.
And not only that, you're absolutely correct to point out the diminishing snowpack, which would via a typically in the past a slow melting could uh, meet out the required water over the course of the summertime. Well, snowpack is disappearing, so losing the water supply. Also, as you mentioned earlier, when you get extremely dry ground, then you get a precipitation bomb. The ground can't absorb that water, and then, as you say earlier, you then just wash away all that topsoil, which then impacts being able to plant crops. Another factor with the warming, with the rising temperatures, is on human physiology. I'm thinking
Mm.
specifically of the wet bulb temperature. And so a lot of people cannot afford to, get buy an air conditioner and keep cool. And when temperatures get above the wet bulb, the ability of the body to adequately cool itself is seriously resulting in hyperthermia that can then, especially for the elderly, uh, will will lead to increased mortality. So that is another issue that we're going to be seeing a lot more of uh, as this continues.
And I don't remember what the last numbers were coming out of the UK, but I do remember within the first 2 days of the heat wave, over 1,500 had died. And I know the
Mm,
numbers across the year have been quite staggering. That was in the first 2 days of the heat wave. And I didn't follow back up on the story, so I'm not sure what the collective death toll was. But that's exactly what we're seeing. That the human body, regardless of how healthy you are, typically can only be exposed to wet bulb temperatures up to about 6 hours before it's going to be lethal. So
mhm.
when you're in a situation, we're also going to be facing this. I mean, people have to get prepared. That in the United States, they have already warned the grid in Texas that Americans may be facing rolling power outages as the summer goes on. And that as these heat waves go on, they're really draining and taxing the energy grid. And what that means is that if people are not able to cool their bodies effectively and they're exposed to these temperatures, people who are healthy in the morning could be dead before the end of the day.
Yeah, and another thing. With regards to power is, as you cited earlier, with the, with the water levels dropping, Lake Powell, Lake Mead, and so forth, there is concern that the water levels will get too low to adequately run the hydroelectric dams that provide electricity. So that is going to be major, major problem should it come to that. And watch out, because then we're really going to be having refugees and increased mortality if people, as you just described, can't keep themselves regulated and within a correct temperature range.
And that's exactly right. One of the generators at the Hoover Dam exploded because the water level was so low. Fortunately, that it didn't cause too many problems internally with the dam and the ability to generate power. But you're exactly right that you don't need water levels to go to zero before we face a real crisis. In fact, if water levels drop to 30% of total capacity, we start facing a real crisis. And we're right there at that level now. So, yeah, we are
Mm,
just a little bit away. It will be interesting to see. I remember it wasn't too long ago that we were talking about day zero in South Africa because of a water crisis. We must be talking about day zero around the world in hundreds of thousands of cities. Today, I mean, I can't imagine how many cities must be facing this. and how many regions must be facing this. But yeah, I think that in here in the United States, we can't be any more than 5 to 10 years away from facing a real problem in the Western United States. Those cities that were built in the desert will not be able to be sustained. They won't have water availability. But Jim, I wanted to ask you a question. What is the state of the oceans right now? We're seeing all these heat waves on the land. Um, is there any relation? Are the water you were talking about thermal diffusion? Are we seeing a little bit of that? Is that contributing to some of the heat waves we're seeing around the world?
Well, the state of the oceans is, to be blunt, not good. Um, I am seeing more and more papers, peer-reviewed papers, uh, all basically expressing how the stratification in various locations of the oceans are increasing. And of course, with that, we're seeing a decrease in net primary productivity, which then ripples through the entire ecosystem. That also leads to other issues. In fact, I just I'm a co-author on a paper that looks like it's going to be submitted to a journal with targeting called Ecological Monographs this week, and we're discussing uh, th- what are the hell that where where we discuss how to better model yeah, where we discuss how to better model tipping points and their relations to mass extinction events. So I wrote a comprehensive section doing a literature review on the major factors that uh, have been demonstrated to result in definitely a decreased biodiversity, which then, if it continues, of course, leads to mass extinction event. And what it comes down to is you can basically summarize as four major factors. One, of course, is increasing water temperature. And of course, keep in mind that, it takes a lot more energy to heat up water than the same volume of air. So when you heat up water 1C, that's considerably more energy than heating up the same volume of air 1C. So that's part of the reason why you have 247 zettajoules of energy in the ocean waiting to diffuse to the atmosphere. I mean, all the stuff we're seeing now is just 7% of what we burned for the last 51 years. The other 93% is gone in the oceans, just waiting to go back out. So one of the major factors is the increasing, the significant increasing of sea surface temperatures. The second major factor is with the absorption of CO2 is the increased acidification, which kills organisms, to be blunt, especially those organisms that require a calcite, some sort of calcium carbonate shell of some sort. And with the increasing water temperatures, you inhibit vertical mixing, which is required for the phytoplanktons to do their thing. Yes, you want seasonal stratification so that the phytoplankton stay within the photic zone, but you want the stratification to take place after the mixing event. Well, we're not even getting the mixing event. We're just having almost continual stratification, or a weakened breakdown of stratifications with the result of inadequate mixing. The result of that is that net primary productivity drops. Well, phytoplanktons create oxygen, so that means it's also leading to areas that have deoxygenation, hypoxic and anoxic zones. So those four factors, increasing water temperatures, increasing acidification, decrease primary productivity, increase occurrences and widespreading of lowered oxygen levels, all lead to decreased biodiversity. And I then further looked at the relationship. How does this all compare to previous mass extinction events. And we're actually now in the middle of the 8th mass extinction event. Two more mass extinction events have been identified. This is a recent development. It's been recently published in the journals, but we've had two other.
Really? I'm sorry, I
Yeah,
had to
yeah.
come in. We're in the eighth
Oh,
mass extinction.
one of them is the one of when number 8.
Okay.
The two that have been identified are the Carnian pluvial mass extinction event about 233 million years ago, and then the
Wow.
N Guadalupean biodiversity of about 260 million years ago are the two newly described
So when
mass
will this
extinction
come
event.
out?
Most of us
Holy crap. Well,
recently,
no, and when
the
will the
authors for the
public know?
Carnian. That I can't, it's in the journal, so I can't
Okay.
talk to
Well, I'm
when
waiting for Naomi
journals
Klein to write
that
an
are
article
being printed.
about this then. All right. Hey, Antonio, do you
But
have any light?
when you, with the exception of the,
You're very
Can you
dark,
guys see me?
Antonio. We can now.
I turned
Okay,
up
I'm
my
leaving.
brightness on my laptop.
but
Thank you. Bye.
most of us are familiar with the, the Devonian extinction, the Ordovician, the Silurian, et cetera, and of course the Cretaceous. They familiar with the 5 previous ones. But what's really interesting is when looking at what were the factors that caused this previous mass extinction, with the exception of the Devonian, which is an interesting story in of itself. But usually you had a massive increase in CO2 levels, typically increased volcanism activities. The increased CO2 levels led to global warming, led to warmer oceanic temperatures. There was a decrease in net primary productivity, an increase in acidification, and of course, deoxygenation spread. Now, in all the previous extinction events, at least one of those was in place to cause, you know, extinction event, and typically they would take place over, several millions of years. Well, you look at today's situation in the ocean, we have all 4 of those taking place. It's so you don't, it's not too difficult to see that, especially if we use the past as a guide, that this will lead to a mass extinction event, at least in the oceans. But if you start killing off the plankton, you're going to start killing off terrestrial organisms because the plankton supply 55 to 80% of atmospheric oxygen. So what's going on in the ocean, the state of the oceans will affect us. I also identified 2 additional factors, namely overfishing and plastic pollution, between micro and nanoplastic pollution. Those are also adversely uh, decreasing, you know, biomass and therefore decreasing biodiversity. So all these things taken together leaves the ocean in a very dire situation. And if the oceans are in a dire situation, then so is terrestrial life.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Just a quick factoid: I know that I was looking into the plastic crisis in the ocean, and they're estimated by 2050 to be more plastic by biomass than actual fish. So
Mm,
it's going to be a very interesting crisis that we're facing here on Earth. And I wanted to, I guess, as we've gotten now into close to an hour in this, is possibly open the floor up to questions or comments from the audience about the state of the planet that we've given. I know that, as I've stated before, it was going to be a sobering conversation on many of the crises that we're seeing unfold on our daily, nightly television shows. So
All right.
I thought this would might be to do that.
Okay. I've got some, and then
Sounds
I
good.
asked for more. So let me get this set up. Okay. Oh, I have quite a few. Well, I don't know if this is a question, but it is a comment. We should have beefed up insulation and other consumption reduction measures decades ago. No greater tech was needed. Not sure what resources would have been needed, but easier than where we are now. Do either one of you have something to say about in that arena? Those kinds of
Well,
mitigation.
Yeah, okay.
Well, I was going to say it's not really directly answering that comment, but really the big elephant in the room is overpopulation. No one wants to talk about overpopulation. More and more people demanding more and more resources that are just not there.
Oh, Jim, I came back in the right time. Okay, that gets the environmental coffeehouse flush of the day. We have to flush away the population. No, we don't. Not really. That's what's happening to us. They're flushing us away, the poor people. They, the illustrious they. Okay, thank you for putting up with me. You know, there you go.
It's
Any
Well,
true.
serious
It's
science. Well, I mean, if this is the "We Are So Fuck" show, we might as well have some humor in it. Sorry. Okay.
my response to that comment is that, I'm very interested in city planning. And, I think about how energy intense our cities are. And one of the things that a comment that comes up often when talking about things that we could have done to reduce our dependence. And, people will say, well, Antonio, why, if you're so concerned, why do you drive? And my response is that, well, honestly, you should think about a system, right? The city that I live in is car centric. So everything that I do in my life is designed around getting there in an automobile. Well, think about that. If you build a civilization that is based on an automobile, the average automobile is 10 times the size of a regular human being. So they're actually large objects in the physical space. Well, you have to make roads for these, right? And look at the
That's what we've
boulevards
done.
that
That's what we've done.
Americans find themselves on. And then look at the grocery stores. Here's the thing that most people don't know: for every car, there's at least 4 or 5 parking spots in your city for your car. Okay, think about the immense amount of space, but not just the space, the material that's required to ensure that sort of lifestyle. Um, so this is an extremely energy intense lifestyle, but the issue here is not asking people to walk. Most people in the United States live anywhere between 20 to 30 minutes away from where they work via car. That sort of same trip is completely impossible by your bike or by walking. That's not a sort of trip that you would do with those type of methods or modes. And so the issue is not about getting people to walk; it's about building cities that are walkable. In cities that are walkable, you don't need cars. So you don't need the space for cars. You also don't need the energy, electric or fossil fuel, for the cars. And therefore, the civilization can actually use a lot less land in its development, and it uses a lot less energy in its daily operation. So there's a lot of different things that, I mean, that's a big and small thing at the same time that we could have done to reduce our impact on the planet. But I really want, the next time that you go out and look at a Walmart, particularly if you live in the southeastern United States, I'm talking to you. The southeastern United States used to be a completely contiguous forest. So when you go to that Walmart parking lot and you just see all around you,
Right.
the only trees are the ones that were purposely planted there. I mean, think about how impactful that type of lifestyle is on the environment, and recognize that's a huge contribution. But of course, at the Walmart, it's not just the Walmart, right? The whole system, that big box store, the energy it takes to keep that store cool for people just to walk in and out all day, the fact that it's a huge food logistics hub. You know, food has to be transported, material has to be transported there so you can buy, and it comes from all over the country and all over the world. I mean, that's a huge energy intense system. So these systems that are embedded in the way that we do things are incredibly energy intense. And I think people are increasingly finding out that doing things like electrifying vehicles is better than having gas vehicles, but it's a very, 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 very small move in terms of reducing our impact on the planet and restoring the biosphere.
Okay. That was a good conversation there on that. Jim, are you a vegan? That was from Dee Dee.
I'm about 95% vegetarian. I'm not vegan.
So, in
The
other words, you might
the
be like
only
me, a little Parmesan cheese here and there, you know, a pizza that might have a little more cheese than with all the vegetables, something like that.
Well, I try to I've greatly reduced my pizza consumption. No, I have a friend of mine. He's got
With vegetables.
I have a friend of mine who he's got a bunch of chickens running around, so I get my eggs from him. And he just feeds them grains, and you know, I play with those chickens when I go over and visit him. Right? They usually hop
Yeah.
in my lap or some damn thing like that. You know, so so I get my eggs there. The meat I consume is not from a grocery store. Um, when Frank goes down to the Copper River to do a massive fishing trip, I usually get about 3 to 5 salmon tossed my way, so that will sustain me for a year. I eat it, space it out. Another friend of ours will go hunting, and sometimes, depending if he gets a moose or a caribou, I'll get couple
The
pounds of
big
that.
ones.
Once in a while, make up a stew. So, and that's all. It's from the Alaskan wild. So I don't buy meat in the grocery stores.
Okay. Well, that's actually oh, I had a question. You're Alaskan, but are there any factory farms or is that business anywhere in Alaska?
Factory farms and not really. I mean, the
It
ground
would
isn't
be
really
yeah,
conducive where we have good ground, like in
it would be indoors.
the the Matsude Valley, the Matanuska Susitna Valley. Uh, they grow, pumpkins that are about 300 frickin' pounds, but it's just like
Okay.
when they grow these zucchini that's like, well, this is a bloody torpedo.
Oh my
It's just like
gosh.
these,
Do they brand
when you
them?
have 24 hours when you have 24 hours of daylight, the plants do get wee bit big. So,
Right.
you can get you can make a few stuffed zucchini that way. But, it's, so a lot of, we do
Mm.
have, and I try to go to the farmer's market here in town, to get the produce in the summertime, because some of the stuff that's grown locally is quite good as compared to the quality of the produce in the stores here, which is, to be blunt, shit. It doesn't last long. It rots out easily because it's
I can't
transported in
stand
from a
buying any of
distance,
that.
and
No,
there's no taste anyway. Well, you're lucky you can
yeah,
grow your stuff here. I can't. The
you
soil
can.
on
No,
my
you'd have
property
to
is,
do it indoor, all indoor with a lot of
it's
light,
it's
intense farm,
permafrost.
growing. Yeah, there you go. Jim lives on the
With the
permafrost.
permafrost, it's dying. So.
Yeah. Pretty soon you'll be having a permamush farm up at Jim's. We're going to go build Jim a
Yeah.
permamush farm. Okay, next question. This was Gary. Hi, Gary. Also, just a note here in Minnesota and the U and corporate ag are working on short corn. Corn. Oh, I lost it. Corn stalks. Corn stalks shorter to be less affected by wind. They hope to market this GMO corn seed to farmers within 2 years. You heard about that one? Wow. Short corn, which means it's like
I,
quick corn, fast
I
corn.
I've not heard of it, but then again, I'm an oceanographer, not a agriculturist, so not up
Well,
on that.
you live in a state that has farming, Antonio, right? You ever come across any of this, or you're in a city environment?
We're we don't farm corn in North Carolina. I don't think
Okay,
actually anywhere in North Carolina.
all
I've
right. I
actually
don't
never
know.
seen a farm like of corn until I left
Really?
up to the north.
Okay, so it's more of
Yeah.
a northern landscape. Okay, so let's see, guys. Okay, unapologetic vegan with 40 million acres of lawn being watered in the U.S. Grow edible landscapes. There you go.
Well, again, that's another comment about the way that we design our cities. Is that
Yeah,
in the United
lawn.
States, particularly when we engaged in the suburban experiment, and I think that's ultimately when our cities were going to be doomed. Cities in themselves, by their nature, are unsustainable, but suburban cities are the most unsustainable that human had ever built. I mean, the idea that you would build a block of houses 20, 30 minutes away from access to food, work, entertainment, and life, that's not the way that any cities beyond before the invention of the automobile were ever created. And what came with this was this idea that people are going to move out to the countryside, that you could build a little house in the woods and have a little nice little, you know, savannah, so to speak, or whatever, grass in your yard and all of that. And there's supposed to be this romantic image of living out in the countryside. And
Yeah.
so what ended up happening is developers would give people these plots of yard that would not do or mean or produce anything. And then, of course, the Supreme Court would actually regulate that. I don't know if many people know this, but you actually can't grow a certain amount of food on your own land. That's regulated by the Supreme Court. And then also, a lot of homeowners associations are very aggressive and violent toward the idea of people growing too much other than just having sod or grass in their yard. And then also, like you say, this grass that doesn't really have any type of ecological or social or economic benefit is the most irrigated crop in the United States.
Hmm. Oh. Okay. We are at the hour mark, so we're going to go quick because I'm about at the neck mark. I mean, for sitting up. Okay, is it even possible to measure the weight of sea ice? I know you can guess how much gumballs are in a jar by one, but that's a little extreme, and I have a big imagination. So actually, it hit me there because he's a bit he's it's a new person, but and he's a little bit of a smart ass, but I welcome him. So can sea ice be weighed? Is there weight to it, Jim? I'll ask you.
Well, if it has mass and
Yeah.
weight is a force, F equals ma, so yes, I mean, sure, I can measure sea ice. I can sit there with a chainsaw, cut out a chunk, stick it on a scale, extrapolate out, or you can make an estimation of, the ice thickness,
There you go.
and then multiply by the ice extent, estimation for the volume, and you can do an estimation for the approximate density, and just multiply it out. So sure, you can easily estimate,
Okay.
it's not going to be exact,
So
but you can
there
estimate, you know
to our new friend,
how much ice you've
Thor.
got.
1 meter times 1 meter is 1 ton. Okay, Thor, thank you for coming. There you go. All right. Well, I think that we don't. Oh, well, here, this is another comment. Having trouble cooling nuclear plants with all the warming water. That's Rich Diana. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff.
That is another issue that was going on, is that, of course, a lot of these quote unquote cool water reactors. And so you can't cool the nuclear fuel rods or the reactor if the outside environment water is increasingly taking on additional heat because it's warming. That is, in fact, a real problem that installations are having. And people have to remember, when these installations were designed, they were designed in many cases back in the 70s, back in the 80s, some even in the 60s. And so there was no understanding or concept that these installations would face dynamic changes in environmental conditions. Um, we won't obviously get into sea level rise and impact on the installation, but yes, the fact that many of the rivers and lakes and coastlines that these installations are seeing temperature changes between 1 to 3 degrees Celsius, and that's impacting their internal operation.
You have to think about this when it's 115 degrees Fahrenheit in a city that has a nuclear plant on a waterway that is used to maybe 90 tops. I mean, I just don't see some of this ending well for nuclear. But anyway, listen,
Well, just with
guys.
this
Oh, go ahead.
last comment, we have a nuclear power plant here in North Carolina off of Lake Norman, and the average temperature around Lake Norman at the peak of the summer is 88 degrees, and we have for weeks on end beginning temperatures around 100. So we're facing the same problem, and they've been actually going using extreme measures to keep um, the water cool, and including using refrigerants to cool down the water before using it to cool the rods.
How much water vapor as well as CO2 will emerge from the permafrost? Darren Johnson wants to know. How
Well, that's the
much?
$64 million question. That's what a lot of researchers are trying to get a handle on. We have some estimate. For example, it's about at least 14 gigatons on the East Siberian Shelf alone in that location. But when you take all the shelf systems in the Arctic Ocean, all the terrestrial uh, land that where there's permafrost, as well as the trapped methane. Of course, that's a different issue, but you have trapped methane at the shelf break that are thermogenic in source. We're trying to get a handle on how much there is. We're trying to get a handle on what is the flux, so that we can then estimate, approximately how much methane is released on a per annum basis, you know, and does it is it released slowly, or does it get released in a
Wow.
large outbursts? Um, so that's in Igor Smelatov has done a fair, quite a bit amount of research on the terrestrial side, and now he and of course Natalia have been working on the shelf question, but it's something that is an area of active research to get a better hand at if we want to improve our modeling.
Okay. Well, there's a lot of chatting going on, but it is an hour, and I'm going to end for the night, guys. So, do you each have a closing comment? And thank you all.
Well,
Well, let
thank our community.
um, the think tank. Go ahead,
Antonio,
Antonio.
you can close. No, let Antonio close up, and Jim, you go, and then Antonio's going to close because it's the state of the planet after all.
Okay. Um, there are some think tanks that basically, according to their analyses, indicate that human civilization will probably not be in a recognizable form by about 2050. Um, Also, keep in mind that there are quite a few population biologists, ecologists, who basically state that an increase of 4C is sufficient to render humans extinct.
Oh,
We're well on the way.
yeah. Yeah. We're already past the eighth mass extinction. All right, Tony, take it away.
Well, thank you guys, our community, for being here tonight. As stated at the onset, I knew this was going to be a sobering conversation. The events that we're starting to see unfold in our world are scary, they are shocking, they are reason for alarm and panic. But we are really all in this together, whether you're in Alaska, New York, North Carolina, or around the world. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Environmental Coffee House.
All right, everybody. Thank you for coming. Really much appreciated, all of you. Like and subscribe. That's all I have for tonight. Jennifer and I will be back on Tuesday. Thank you, Jim Massa and Tony. Do you have a channel yet? Not yet. Almost. He's
Night.
almost there. Okay, but I will put Nick's and Jim's stuff in the show notes. All right. Here we go.
Peace out, everyone.
Peace out. Peace out.